Our next speaker this evening is Karen Chodos. Karen grew up in South Africa. She was the oldest sibling of 3, with a mother who experienced deep depression and anxiety for most of her life. This growing up for Karen taught her a great sense of compassion for others, but it also had deep influences on most aspects of her life and her relationships. You will hear Karen share her mother's very difficult experience with mental health institutions in South Africa in the 1980s. I want to acknowledge that this was a very different time. And while we still have a long way to go when it comes to improving mental and emotional health care, we have also come a long way since then. There are also many people in our community who can hand on their hearts say that going to an inpatient clinic have saved their life. Please keep this in mind as you listen to Karen's deeply personal story. Her story touches on the profound distress that a family can experience having a parent experiencing severe mental health challenges. Please welcome Karen.
Good evening. And just to correct one thing, I'm actually the youngest of the siblings. My mum loved her family and her darling Julian, my dad. She loved Friday night dinners with the family. She was kind and welcoming. She loved her friends and socializing and knitting scarves for complete strangers, even when she could no longer see. She loved dancing. She loved laughing, especially at herself. This was my mum in her good times. But this wasn't the mum we grew up with, because for most of our lives, she experienced a complex depressive disorder with no obvious external cause. This is my story. I was about 7 years old when my mom began to show signs of anxiety and depression. I don't recall much about those early days, except that she would spend much of the time on her bed crying and breathing into a brown paper bag. Her suffering became so acute that she was admitted to a clinic where they treated people with shock treatment. I remember visiting my mom at the clinic and seeing her sitting on a bed, expressionless. It was a very bare room, and I think there were bars on the window. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't know how to act in front of this woman who was supposedly my mom. It was Christmas time, and the Salvation Army band was playing in the courtyard. The patients were encouraged to sing along to the Christmas carols. Sadly, many of them, my mom included, seemed lifeless. This vision has remained with me my whole life. I cannot recollect anyone ever explaining to us what was happening to my mom and why she needed to be at that place. During this period of my life, I recall my dad taking me to a birthday party of a friend from school, and I wouldn't let him leave me there. I clung on to him for dear life. I was so insecure and afraid of being abandoned. At school, I would very often experience stomach aches and wanted to go home. However, my mom wasn't the one to pick me up from sick bay. It was my aunt instead. The shock treatment my mom received didn't really help. The only thing it did was destroy some of her short-term memory. Soon began the old patterns of crying all the time, not wanting to get out of bed, fear of crowds, fear of driving, and hyperventilating. We were once again living in a home of uncertainty. Was my mom going to be on her bed crying? Was she going to be available for us when we got home from school? We had to tiptoe around, not cause any trouble for fear of making things worse for her. I don't recall much laughter or happy times then. Honestly, I don't remember much from those days. After much suffering, my mom was eventually admitted to a psychiatric hospital called Tara in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she remained for an entire year. I was about 11 or 12 at the time, and not having her around during this period of my life was very significant. I remember taking my school photos to show her when I visited. I was so proud of being in the sports teams and wanted to share this with her because I thought it would cheer her up, but it didn't. And this made me feel insignificant. I didn't understand what was going on. Most of all, I remember that my mom was not at home, and for a lot of the time I felt lost and alone. No one explained what was happening to her and why she had to be in an institution. There was no support for us. We were left just to be. No one ever asked us how we really were, because in their eyes, we weren't the sick ones. At some point, they found a drug that began to reduce the severity of her depression, but she was still highly sensitive, and we had to be mindful that any trivial thing could set her back. We constantly had to watch what we said to her. It was horrible. We weren't really allowed to be ourselves. We had to be strong, even if we weren't. Tara in those days was very misunderstood by people outside its huge brown walls. Children at school would make fun of other children by saying, "We'll send you to Tara if you act like a crazy person." This would really upset me. No one knew that my mother was in Tara, but she wasn't crazy. She was ill. In high school, my grades began to slip, and I had no motivation to work. In class, I became totally disengaged and spent time doodling or staring out the window. This was completely opposite to the hard-working and committed student I used to be. I felt huge disappointment in myself and began to lose confidence in my abilities. I kept a lot of this to myself as I feared the repercussions from my parents, especially my mom, as I didn't want to upset her. Sport was my saving grace. I took every opportunity to stay after school and remain there as late as possible, because home was fraught with hushed tones and sadness. My mom would be in her room, crying on the bed. About 7 years after my mom was first admitted, she decided to come off her medication. Towards the end of her life, she wrote a memoir where she described what that time was like. I was sent from one hospital to another, one sanatorium to another, put onto drips, locked up, tied down, medicated, over-medicated, in intensive care, in a twilight zone, in a vacuum, and away from everybody and everything. And finally, I was back in Tara. This all happened over a long and uncertain 9-month period. In the first few hospitals my mom was admitted to, the nurses and doctors had no idea how to help her. We would visit her in all these places and witness her struggles. But no one really realized or understood we had our own struggles too. Being without a mother and seeing her in these kinds of places was a constant emotional battle. One particular institution that I remember was the most horrendous place, like a nightmare. There were people experiencing various mental illnesses. They scared me, and I didn't know how to act towards them. I saw my mom in a state I'd never encountered before. She couldn't speak. She stuttered and made no sense at all. No one explained to me that she was so drugged that she couldn't function properly. It was a terrifying and heartbreaking experience. Then there was a time I answered the phone at home. It was a doctor who proceeded to tell me that they had admitted my mom to ICU as she was very ill. I remember not understanding why the doctor delivered this news to me. How was I supposed to respond? After a traumatic journey through 6 hospitals, my mom eventually returned to Tara. The first time she returned home after 9 months away was on my 21st birthday. She was given a weekend pass. It was a nerve-wracking time, and as I wasn't sure how she would be. It was strange having her home. I had gotten used to her being away. Looking back, I don't think I really realized the effect it was all having on me. I remember one day when I attended a college athletics carnival. We had traveled out of town and began drinking on the bus. I became so drunk during the course of the day that my friends had to take me to the public swimming pool and put me in cold water to sober me up. I remember being in the water and crying whilst calling out, "My poor mum, my poor mum." By that time, I had taken over the running of the house. Both my sister and brother were living in their own homes. The house often seemed empty, and I felt alone and full of responsibility. At no time whatsoever was it recommended by anyone that we seek counselling as a family or individuals. our thoughts, our feelings, and what effect my mom's trauma had on us was not really considered. We were, in a sense, the forgotten people. We were the support without being supported. We were the silent ones. During my mid-20s, my siblings immigrated to Australia, and I became involved with a man who was an alcoholic. My life was extremely inconsistent for 3 years. I constantly fought a battle between pleasing my parents and my boyfriend. I struggled to cope in this turmoil. I had to seek therapy. The therapist helped me make sense of the connection between my boyfriend and my mom. I couldn't fix my mom, so I desperately tried fixing him. Instead, I became the leaning post for both of them. My mom had great difficulty expressing her love for us, to us. I believe she lived with a lot of guilt for not having been around for much of our formative years. She struggled to show us affection, and I know I had great difficulty feeling comfortable being affectionate towards her. I never got to experience the close bond that a daughter could have with her mother. I have never resented my mom for any of this. Through time and maturity, I learned to understand it. My mother's fight with her illness was beyond anything she could control. It was not her fault. Sadly, my mom battled her experience with depression and anxiety for 46 years. The degree to which it affected her was always changing. Thinking back, she and our family never had any guarantees that her days would be free of her worries. It was always difficult for those around her to fully comprehend the extent of her illness. We seldom got to see the happy side of her. My mom fought tremendous battles, but we did too. If I think about it, for much of our lives, when my mom was alive, our roles were reversed. We had to be the adults. My mom was very often like a needy child. I never thought this to be fair and would often wish for normalcy of the parent-child relationship. We had to be constant givers and carers. My father stood by her till her dying day. He showed us what true love, commitment, and compassion are. He taught us how to be caring human beings, and for this I am grateful. Along this tough, heartbreaking journey, there were days when I thought that I'd had enough of being strong and wanted to shout out, "Enough is enough." However, I have remained stalwart and focused on the positive lessons to be learned that I believe have made me a stronger, resilient, kind, empathetic person with a good ear for listening. Through my experiences with my mom, I know I have gained a deep understanding of those that are struggling with mental health. The impact of my mom's trauma went beyond her own suffering. It affected her family too. The hardest part was no one talked to us about it or what was happening. We all ended up in the dark. So, I hope that sharing my story tonight will move us in a better direction, where we can talk openly about mental health and support everyone affected. I'll leave you with this quote from Glenn Close. "What mental health needs is more sunlight, more candor, and more unashamed conversation." Thank you.